Former idol got publicly called jealous, bitter, and washed by the fighter who had spent years telling every microphone in range that he wanted to be exactly like him when he grew up in this sport. Sean O'Malley sat down with ESPN and delivered a verdict on Conor McGregor that no amount of loyalty could have survived bitter jealous on a losing streak, pulling out fights over a broken toe, not Conor-like at all. Said it plainly and without diplomatic softening. I'm 29 and I've already defended a belt, something McGregor has never done, and I feel pure jealousy from him and I just find that sad. Then on his own podcast he went further and removed any remaining ambiguity about where he stood. The exact quote was, "He's a jealous bitch. That's what he is, he's on drugs," delivered to his own audience without a filter in place. The man who had spent years studying McGregor's movement, his confidence, his entire approach to the sport and to competition was now calling him a jealous drug user on a podcast watched by millions of combat sports fans. The internet did not need to wait for a press conference to process that. The clip spread within hours, and the question that followed them everywhere was the same question nobody had a clean answer for yet. The source of all of it traces back to a single night and a single tweet that was originally not even about Sean O'Malley at all, which makes the entire timeline significantly more absurd than the highlight reel suggests. Ryan Garcia had just beaten Devin Haney in one of the biggest boxing upsets of the year, and within days the post-fight coverage was consumed entirely by the news that Garcia had reportedly tested positive for ostarine before and on the day of the fight. McGregor had been publicly supportive of Garcia before this development. He had been in his locker room after a previous loss. He had called him the future of boxing. He had genuine emotional investment in the relationship. The positive test felt like a betrayal, and McGregor responded to that feeling the way McGregor has always responded to strong emotions, by opening the social media app and beginning to type without anyone in the room suggesting he slowed down. He called for a lifetime ban, described himself as genuinely disgusted, told Garcia not to come near him. Then, without any logical connective tissue between those sentences and the next one, brought O'Malley into the post entirely. He wrote that the ostarine situation reminded him of O'Malley being on that as well, challenged both men to fly out and spar, and compared them to ostriches he would ride, which he deleted shortly after but not before it had been screenshotted approximately 1 million times. O'Malley's initial reaction was not rage, it was confusion. And the confusion was genuine because he had not seen this version of McGregor aimed in his direction before and did not immediately have a framework for processing it. He described seeing the post and thinking what the actual expletive is happening, then trying to rationalize it, telling himself that McGregor was probably just geeked out or in some altered state and was going to walk it back. Then O'Malley arrived at the theory that became the foundation of everything he said about McGregor for the next year. McGregor had wanted him to sign with McGregor's management company. O'Malley had turned it down, and the tweet was the consequence. He saw his star rising without McGregor's infrastructure behind it, and responded by linking him to a doping scandal. Sean O'Malley's reading was not a criticism about performance-enhancing drugs, but a territorial dispute about who controls whose success. That framing converted a confusing tweet about ostriches and banned substances into a personal betrayal, not from a rival but from a mentor who had decided that an ungrateful student needed to be publicly diminished. Once O'Malley decided that with the actual explanation, there was no version of his response that stayed measured. Because the injury was not to his record or his reputation, it was to the relationship he had spent years building and publicly celebrating. The escalation from confused silence to full-on public roasting happened over a period of weeks as O'Malley processed his position, and decided that his best response was to make McGregor's supposed jealousy the central story of every interview he did. He told ESPN that McGregor was older, on a 2-fight losing skid, pulling out with a broken toe, and that this was not the version of McGregor he had admired, not Conor-like, and that the departure from that standard was generating pure jealousy aimed outward. He said the quiet part loud with a line that ended up as the headline on every MMA outlet covering the story. "When your idols turn to rivals is a real thing," delivered with the tone of someone who had made peace with a significant loss. He was simultaneously landing sharp shots at McGregor's career and painting himself as the generous one in the exchange, saying he hoped he would never become bitter when younger fighters passed him by, that he would be excited and mentoring rather than jealous and attacking. That is an extraordinarily sophisticated piece of trash talk. You cannot really argue with it without sounding like exactly what he is accusing you of being. Because any defensive response confirms the jealousy narrative, and any silence confirms the decline narrative. O'Malley had built a rhetorical trap out of a deleted tweet about ostriches, and the man it was aimed at chose not to walk into it by responding in the obvious way. McGregor's silence through the worst of the O'Malley commentary was not the silence of someone who had not heard what was being said. It was the silence of someone calculating what kind of response would land the hardest. The response eventually arrived months later, after O'Malley had lost his bantamweight title to Merab Dvalishvili and was in recovery from labrum surgery, which created a specific context for what McGregor chose to say. He did not call O'Malley jealous back. He did not revisit the ostarine material. He did not write a multi-paragraph counter-rant explaining his side of the original tweet that had started everything. He posted that he would love to see O'Malley and his coach Tim Welch do a 4-week stint at SBG Ireland under John Kavanagh's coaching, and that if they did, he was telling the world that O'Malley would regain his title. He did that with the specific subtext intact. This is not a compliment. This is a man telling a former student that the reason he lost his championship is that he needs his old coach and his old gym to be great again. The message underneath the gracious framing was as precise as any left hand McGregor has ever thrown. You need my team, you need my infrastructure. And without those things, you are the guy who lost his title and needed surgery. The reaction to that post was immediate and revealing because it did not read to the media or the public as an aggressive clapback. It read as McGregor positioning himself as the mentor, while O'Malley was still in recovery from what the mentor was now offering to fix. Every outlet that covered the exchange framed it as McGregor squashing beef and inviting O'Malley to train at SBG Ireland. She converted the post from a subtle put-down into an olive branch that still contained the thorns, but was covered in enough leaves that most people only noticed the gesture. O'Malley's response to that shift was described in coverage as 3 words, a stark contrast to the multi-paragraph tirades and the podcast sessions where he had called McGregor a jealous bitch and questioned his sobriety at length. Guy who had spent a year telling every available microphone that his former idol was washed and beatable, and Bitter suddenly had very little to say when the former idol responded with something other than anger. That asymmetry, loud and repeated attacks generating a quiet and condescending counter, is the dynamic that defines this entire exchange, and it says something specific about both men that goes beyond the entertainment value of the trash talk. O'Malley understood power and presence well enough to recognize that McGregor responding as a mentor, rather than a rival, was the one response that could not be answered, without making the situation worse for the person answering. John Kavanagh's response to being asked about the feud adds a dimension that the clip compilations tend to skip over because it illuminates what McGregor's actual inner circle was doing, while O'Malley was generating headlines. Kavanagh said bluntly that he does not follow the drama side of the sport closely, that he does not click on articles about what one fighter said about another fighter, and that he wished O'Malley all the best, delivered with the flat tone of someone who had been asked about something they consider genuinely beneath their attention level. A coach choosing to publicly express complete indifference to an active feud involving his own fighter is its own message. It communicates that the camp considers the noise insufficient to warrant engagement, which is the most dismissive possible response outside of total silence. That response circulated in the coverage and only added momentum to the story because it showed how far O'Malley's comments had penetrated the UFC ecosystem. Even people claiming disinterest were being asked about it in professional interview settings. The fight game had produced a feud where one side was generating multi-platform, deeply personal, ongoing public commentary, and the other side was responding either with calculated condescension or with a specific kind of indifference that combat sports veterans deploy, and they want to signal that the loudest voice in the room is not the most important one. O'Malley had the energy and McGregor had the posture, and the history of MMA suggests that those two things are not equivalent forms of leverage even when the energy is louder and more consistent. Contradiction sitting at the center of O'Malley's entire offensive is the thing that eventually became impossible to ignore once the volume on the feud dropped enough to hear the actual content underneath. He called McGregor jealous and bitter and washed across multiple platforms over multiple months. And during the same stretch of interviews, he answered the question of who the face of the UFC currently was by saying it was still McGregor, 100%. Without a moment of hesitation. He called him a dork in the same breath, but the admission was there, and it was clear. The man he was spending so much energy dismantling was still the undisputed center of the sport's commercial and cultural identity in O'Malley's own analysis. You do not spend a year systematically attacking the legacy of someone you actually believe is irrelevant. You spend a year attacking someone whose relevance is so established that dismantling it would represent a meaningful achievement. The jealousy accusation was aimed at McGregor, but the subtext of every interview was that O'Malley was trying to claim a cultural position that McGregor still occupied. He was trying to claim it by tearing it down rather than by building something equivalent from a different foundation. McGregor's silence, and then his mentor-framed response, worked specifically because they refused to acknowledge that the position was even in dispute, which is the most effective possible response to someone trying to take something from you by convincing you it's worth fighting for. The resolution arrived not through a dramatic confrontation or a scheduled fight, but through the quieter process of O'Malley losing his title, reflecting on what went wrong, and beginning to acknowledge publicly that trying to be McGregor had actually been part of the problem. He told an interviewer that the way McGregor carried himself into fights, the confidence to call outcomes publicly, it genuinely shaped how he approached competition, and for a period it helped him, and then it started working against him. He said he got lost in wanting to be like Conor too much instead of being like himself, which is a more honest and more complete account of this entire feud than any of the jealousy accusations or the podcast rants managed to produce. A fighter who called his idol a jealous bitch and questioned his sobriety on a globally distributed podcast eventually sat down in McGregor's own media space and admitted he would always be a fan, that McGregor had one of the craziest careers in the sport's history, and that he was glad the relationship was back in a good place. That walk from jealous bitch to I'll always be a Conor fan, delivered in McGregor's own house, is the full arc of what the Ostarine tweet actually set in motion, and it ended not with O'Malley claiming the position he was trying to take, but with him returning to the position he had always actually occupied. The rivalry consumed a year of interviews and produced thousands of articles, and it concluded with a former student admitting that most of what he had built as a fighter was constructed from studying the man he had spent that year trying to dismantle. The mechanics of how McGregor managed this situation without a single curse word or a single angry response are worth examining specifically because they run counter to every expectation that his public persona creates. Every previous McGregor feud has followed the same structural template. Provocations escalate into a press conference. The press conference produces a moment. The moment drives pay-per-view buys. And the cycle concludes inside an octagon where the talking becomes irrelevant. This one did not follow that template, and it could not follow that template because McGregor was not in a position to fight O'Malley at bantamweight, was not fighting at all during most of the feud's most intense period, and had no competitive venue where the argument could be resolved on the terms both men understand best. Without the fight as the end point, the feud required a different kind of management, and McGregor found it in the one response: O'Malley's framework had not accounted for genuine condescension delivered as generosity. Offering someone your gym and your coach after they have spent a year calling you jealous and washed is not turning the other cheek, and it is not escalating the conflict. It is repositioning yourself as the one with resources the other person clearly needs, which is a more dominant posture than anything either insult or silence could have created. The fact that O'Malley's three-word response was described as almost sheepish compared to his previous fire confirms that the move landed. The loudest voice in the feud went quiet the moment its target responded, as if none of the noise had been worth raising his own voice over. Final image of this rivalry is not O'Malley calling McGregor a jealous bitch on a podcast. It is O'Malley ahead of his UFC 316 rematch rewatching McGregor vs Nate Diaz for inspiration, and saying simply that he has always taken inspiration from Conor fights. That image is the most honest account of what this entire year-long feud was actually about. A student who outgrew his classroom and then struggled with the transition. He processed that struggle by attacking the teacher, and who eventually found his way back to the thing that had actually made him good. McGregor never needed to defend himself against the jealousy accusations, because the evidence against them was O'Malley's own behavior. Studying McGregor's footwork before his own fights, measuring his career against McGregor's milestones, answering questions about the face of the UFC with McGregor's name without being prompted. Both men got something from this feud. O'Malley got a year of headline-generating content and an honest reckoning with what his own identity as a fighter was built on. And McGregor got to demonstrate that his brand was secure enough to absorb a year of direct assault from a champion, and answer with an invitation rather than a defense. The tweet about ostriches that started all of this was gone within hours, but everything it set in motion took over a year to fully exhaust itself. The end result was a fighter admitting that his hero had not diminished at all. Not in the standings, not in the culture, and not in the imagination of the former student who had tried very hard to believe otherwise. O'Malley's own words are the final verdict on this feud, and they delivered it clearly without any assistance from McGregor. I got lost wanting to be like Conor too much instead of being like myself. Which is the most complete possible explanation for why the jealousy accusations never quite landed the way he needed them to.